Thanks to all of you who've made this event possible. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this panel, The Collector, the Professor, and the Curator, How Frederick Douglass's Family Papers Came to Yale. It is not often that a collection of this significance moves from private hands into a public research institution. This panel will offer multiple perspectives on the story of how Dr. Evans' Frederick Douglass collection came to Yale and the impact that these materials have had and will have on research, teaching, and learning. Here you see the New York Times article announcing this acquisition this July, right before the Beinecke's annual reading of the Declaration of Independence, and Douglass's own 1852 address, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" Frederick Douglass is such a recognizable and widely known figure of the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. This collection of correspondence, family papers, and scrapbooks is unique in that it tells Douglass's story as curated by his own family. I will briefly introduce you to some of the items in the collection before we hear from our panelists. This wonderful picture of Dr. Evans and Professor Blight was taken in Dr. Evans' home on one of the research trips Professor Blight took to use this collection for his biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. The collection first became known to Professor Blight in 2006. Pictured here is one of the 9 scrapbooks in the collection of news clippings about Douglass and other ephemera kept by the family, primarily Douglass's sons, Charles, Frederick Jr., and Lewis. Some of the newspaper articles in these scrapbooks are from African American newspapers that are not commonly available elsewhere, and many are annotated by the family. You can move forward 2 slides. So here's the annotation from the family. Thank you. Douglass, the most photographed American in the 19th century, is shown here in a number of different representations in the family scrapbooks. The scrapbooks also include a more personal glimpse into the Douglasses' lives, such as this ephemera from a dance at Cambridge High School in Massachusetts that Frederick Jr. attended with his future wife, Virginia. Other highlights of the collection include correspondence between Lewis Douglass and his wife Amelia, while Lewis served in the famous Massachusetts 54th Regiment during the Civil War, text of several of Douglass's addresses as recorded by the family, and letters from Frederick Douglass Sr. to Lewis from Haiti when he served as consul there from 1889 to 1891. Here we see the collection's arrival at Yale in early March when it joined the Beinecke's James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of African American Arts and Letters. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to the panelists for this evening. So first we have the collector, Dr. Walter O. Evans. Dr. Walter O. Evans is a retired surgeon who has spent decades collecting and curating a wide variety of artwork, books, and manuscripts in an effort to preserve African American cultural history. After a long medical career in Michigan, Walter returned to his birthplace of Savannah, Georgia, where he has forged a close relationship with Savannah College of Art and Design. The college is now home to the Walter O. Evans Center for African American Studies, and a wing of its museum houses artworks given by Walter. He has exhibited works from his collection at more than 45 museums around the country. Before it came to Yale earlier this year, his Frederick Douglass collection was recently featured in a special exhibition at the National Gallery of Art. We are thrilled that the Beinecke Library is now home to several collections of Walter's, including a significant group of James Baldwin manuscripts. Next, the professor, David Blight. David Blight is the Sterling Professor of History, African American Studies, and American Studies at Yale, and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. A member of the Yale faculty since 2003, David has published and lectured widely on abolitionism, American historical memory, and African American intellectual and cultural history. His most recent book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, received 8 book awards, including the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in History. David is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has served as president of the Society of American Historians. And the curator, excuse me, Melissa Barton. Melissa Barton, a 2002 graduate of Yale College, is curator of drama and prose for the Yale Collection of American Literature, which includes the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of African American Arts and Letters at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Melissa has curated many exhibitions, including Gather Out of Stardust, the Harlem Renaissance and the Beinecke Library, which drew thousands of people to the library in 2017. Melissa writes and presents frequently about teaching with collections, and she teaches a Yale College seminar at Beinecke drawn from the James Weldon Johnson collection. So to get us started, Walter, I'm going to ask you our first question, which is, how did you come to collect African Americana, and what brought you to Frederick Douglass?
Okay, I have to go back a few years. I graduated from Hartford Public High School in Hartford, Connecticut in 1961. Didn't go straight to college. I went into the Navy. And during my time in the Navy, I was stationed in Philadelphia, and I went to a party, and I met this young lady who wanted to go to the museum. I had never been in an art museum in my life, even though we did have a great museum up there. I had never been in it. Anyway, in order to impress her, I went to the library down the street from the museum to study all that I would see in the museum. And when we got there, I started telling her about Degas and Renoir, etc. Anyway, she was quite impressed. However, our relationship did not last when I went away to college in Washington. She also introduced me to reading. I mean, when I was in high school, I read what I was supposed to read. But the first book that she introduced me to was Richard Wright, Native Son. So when I went away to, by the time I went away to college a year and a half later, I had been to all of the museums in the Northeast and had been to many libraries, and I was quite well read by the time I got to college. So after college, went to medical school, then residency many years later. And with my first expendable monies, I started buying African-American art, books, letters, and manuscripts. And the reason for this was that I didn't see many of these items in the museums and libraries that I had visited. Maybe some in the libraries, but never in the museum. So I started collecting and eventually became quite addicted to it. Now, the Douglass material. The Douglass material didn't come available to me until, maybe 6 to 8 years into my collecting. And normally the dealers, the antiquarian book dealers would call me when they had something special. This time, he didn't call me. So when I got the catalog, I called him immediately and I said, hey, what's up? You know, you're supposed to call me about this. This is very special. And he said, well, I really didn't want you to have it. I wanted it to go to some institution. And I said, they're not going to get it. I'm going to send you a deposit. And I did. And that followed. So 30 days later, about a month later, I sent him the balance. And I got this huge batch of Frederick Douglass material. But there were other additions to it. There was an equal edition from the same dealer about a year later, and there were other minor parts to it. So that's how I came about the Douglass material.
That's wonderful, thank you. David, you recently completed a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Frederick Douglass. How did you initially come into contact with Walter's collection, and what role did it play in your research for that book?
Well, first of all, I just want to say what a thrill it is to even have this event now. It has been 14 years, as you pointed out, since I first met Walter in Savannah, Georgia. It was a chance encounter. It is one of those cases of the blind good luck of a historian being in the right place at the right time. I went there to give a talk on Frederick Douglass's narrative, his first autobiography, to middle and high school teachers. And my host there was the Georgia Historical Society, and they said, there's this really interesting man here in town who's a collector, and he wants to go to lunch. And we went to lunch. That day, Walter took me over to his house and showed me at least portions of that Douglass collection on his dining room table. And that is how we actually met. Now, as Walter can tell you, I didn't decide overnight by any means to attempt a full new life of Douglass. That was rather daunting at that moment, but I'd worked on Douglass on and off most of my career. One thing led to another. And I finally signed up. And I spent, I've lost count, 5 or 6 Yale spring breaks in Savannah, numerous other weeks in Savannah, working in this, well, the Beinecke is the greatest, but the other greatest archive I've ever worked in, which is Walter and Linda Evans's dining room. And that photograph that you all saw there, that is in front of one of Walter's Duncansons. His house is a museum of treasures of African-American art, and rare books are all over the house, as are manuscript boxes, including in the TV room, which is where he once told me his Baldwin letters were, up to the right of the television, if I just looked. Anyway, this has been the most important chance encounter of my career. And anyone who has my book will note that I dedicated this book to Walter and Linda Evans because they became such good friends and indeed my patrons in this research. And I just say quickly too, that collection did many, many things for the life of Douglass, but especially it opens up the last third of Douglass's life and the lives of his family as never before.
Thank you. Melissa, why was the Beinecke Library interested in acquiring the Evans collection?
Thank you. I also want to start by just thanking the organizers of the event and say what a pleasure it is to be here in company with such a wonderful group of people. Beinecke is honored and thrilled to be the stewards of Walter's collections, including the Frederick Douglass material. Many people are aware that Beinecke is home to the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of African American Arts and Letters, which was founded in 1941. It's one of the leading collections of its kind, including books and manuscripts from the beginnings of African American literary history to the present day. The materials from the James Weldon Johnson collection are routinely among the most used in the Beinecke reading room and its classrooms. This includes the Langston Hughes papers, which top the list of the most frequently requested collections year over year, as well as Walter's collection of James Baldwin letters, which we acquired in 2014, just over 100 letters from Baldwin to various recipients. They are seen in the classroom all the time. And so we have a strong commitment and have for many, many years had a strong commitment to African American literary and historical materials. Walter's collection, the Douglass collection, fits well alongside our noted 19th century holdings, which include the Randolph Lindsley Simpson collection. Simpson was also a Connecticut man from Hartford, like Walter, who started out wanting to collect Frederick Douglass. He loved Frederick Douglass. He was born in Rochester. And he decided to kind of branch out and build a collection of hundreds of photographic portraits, starting with portraits of Douglass. The one that you saw at the beginning of Douglass and his grandson, there's a print of that in Simpson's collection. So the James Weldon Johnson collection strives to be broad and deep in its holdings related to African American arts and letters historically. And I think it's important that we note, and I'm sure David will talk about this too, that we view Douglass very much as a literary figure as well as a historical figure. And so for that reason, it's a really wonderful complement to the holdings in our collection.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. It's been such a pleasure to note the strong relationships between these three through this process. And so, Walter, I'd love to ask you a bit about the researchers that you've hosted at your home in your collections that have frequently been exhibited. How do you conceive of your role as a collector in relation to scholars and institutions?
Well, as I said, I began collecting because I didn't see much African-American material in libraries and museums at that time. So I not only wanted this for my own self-interest, but for my family. I had twin daughters that were young at the time I started collecting, and I wanted to share with them this knowledge, but also people in the community. In fact, I started out, at the same time I started collecting, I started inviting artists and writers to my home in Detroit, where my career was. And I just loved the experience of having people, and I would take these artists, people like Ramir Bearden, Jacob Lawrence, and Elizabeth Catlett. I would take them to some of the schools, public schools around the area, and have them give a talk there, as well as have a reception at my home. Now, I didn't do much sharing of my books and manuscripts and letters because I really didn't. I didn't want to. I didn't feel that people would think kindly of my addiction to this vast amount. So they can understand art, but they didn't understand all these books. Right now, as David was saying, David has never been in 2 of the rooms in my house. My wife hasn't even been in there. I can hardly get in there because it's filled with books and letters and manuscripts, etc. So anyway, after David was the one who started the scholars, I had known many museum directors, curators, writers, etc. But David was the first research scholar to come and view some of this. And then he told other research scholars, and they started coming. And it was a pilgrimage of sorts. And all of these people have written or are writing books, people such as Zoe Trott and Rita Roberts, Celeste Marie Bernier, Ezra Greenspan, and so many more. And actually, I enjoyed it. And they started teaching me things about my own collection because they're the scholars. I'm the collector. I collect something and, I'll peruse it, sort of. But then, I'm on to the next conquest. But these scholars started teaching me about, and then since David's book, and since he's gone back to teaching full-time, I guess.
Always teaching full-time.
Okay, well, we're doing a lot of traveling after that book. But anyway, there was a young senior student from Yale that called me last week that David had contacted. So that's the new layer of folks coming by. And it's exciting for me. Keep them coming, David.
You bet. That's a student in my current seminar.
Yes.
So thank you for taking her call.
Oh, absolutely. We had a very nice talk.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
So for me, it's all about sharing, and the more the merrier.
That's wonderful that the sort of next generation of scholars are able to have access to the collection as well.
By the way, as an extension, more people will be able to peruse the collection now that it's at the Beinecke and has been digitized. So.
Absolutely. That's great. So David, you've said a bit about the preparation for your book and the use of the collections, but what can you say a bit more about what role archival collections play in your work as a scholar and a teacher?
Well, the archives are everything for my work. I mean, each book I've ever written. I wrote a book called Race and Reunion about the memory of the Civil War, and that was gleaned from countless collections and archives all over the South and North and in between. Douglas material existed, of course, at the Library of Congress, University of Rochester, and various other places in bits and pieces. But there's no other collection like the Evans collection. And had I not encountered that collection, I simply would never have written this book. I had no intention to do it, and it simply wouldn't have happened. And I have to say, folks, Walter knows what he's collecting. Don't let him kid you. Yes, he's the collector, but he knows what's in these boxes. And he would often hover over me some days, and he would say, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? And I'd start describing a letter, or especially newspaper clippings of this and that and this and that. And Douglas, and sometimes, here I am calling you Douglas, sometimes Walter would say, no, that's not in there. I don't know that. And I said, well, come on, here, look, Well, there are thousands upon thousands of newspaper clippings assembled in these scrapbooks, and no one perhaps can ever look at each one of them, although I tried. This collection, as I said, is so important because it catalogs and opens up, reveals the last third of Mr. Douglas's life as never before. It's always been the case that if Americans tend to know Frederick Douglass, they know the young Douglas, the heroic Douglass, who escapes from slavery, becomes a famous orator. They may know something about, he had some role in the Civil War, but they don't know the aging Douglass, the older Douglass. And if they do at all, there's always been an assumption that Douglass sort of fell out of touch, and in his older years, he wasn't as relevant. That is just not true. And what is such a treasure in this collection are those scrapbooks. I mean, the letters are too, but the scrapbooks, assembled principally by two of his sons, although the whole family had a role in them, are just a treasure trove of newspaper clippings and all kinds of other documents cataloging their father's life over the last 30 to 35 years. And it allowed me endless examples of texture, of little pieces of context. When Douglass is on this speaking tour or that speaking tour. And as Walter well knows, the family hired a clipping service somewhere in the 1880s. Douglass lived till 1895. They hired a clipping service called the American Bureau, which I didn't even know existed. And so by then, a lot of the clippings are stamped. They're coming back from all kinds of small towns. It allows a biographer texture, local stories, and windows into this man's aging life, the politics of his life, the personal standing of his life, his relationships, his friendships, his rivalries, and his ideas about politics, about race, and about many other issues. So the older Douglass, to me, kind of took over the book, and the reason is the Evans collection. And again, I can't say enough about how my chair at the end of that table in the Evans dining room, is the luckiest chair I've ever sat in.
Now, David, would you mind saying just a bit more about your use of the archives for teaching, your direct engagement with students? Thanks.
Well, sure. I love I'm doing a seminar right now on the life and writings of Douglass, and I would, as Melissa knows, I would have brought them to the Beinecke. We would have gotten out the Frederick Douglass newspapers, and this time the Evans collection. What a thrill that would have been. And if for no other reason than to let students touch and see and spend time with and read original documents. I do this in the summer too with teacher institutes, which I've done for 25 years. And a teacher from a public school wherever in the United States is never so thrilled as when you can bring them into the Sterling or the Beinecke for a whole afternoon with a table full of original documents, whether it's about Frederick Douglass or it's about abolitionism or it's about slavery or about whatever else I'm running the seminar about, and just to see them be able to handle and read original documents is a thrill for me. But also it introduces the Yale undergraduates to the magic of the collections that exist in these two great research libraries that we have here. And it gets them comfortable with archives. It gets them engaged with real documents, and they begin to see, aha, this is how you do this. And some of them just take to it. I have an undergraduate research assistant right now named Kate Kushner, and she is just an archive hawk. And she's so good at it. She's been in the James Weldon Johnson collection for me because I'm doing a new biography of Johnson. She's so good at this that I've hired her as one of the research assistants on the Yale and Slavery project. The rest of them are all graduate students. She's still only an undergraduate. At any rate, there are endless possibilities, and a lot of the faculty here at Yale love using the Beinecke for, in fact, some people teach whole courses in the Beinecke when we're in normal times. I usually just go in for one session here and one session there about all kinds of documents.
That's great. I also love the notion of an archive hawk. That's a wonderful image.
No. Once you're bitten by it.
There's no going back, right?
Yeah. And by the way, I have to say too, one of the reasons Walter and I got along so fast and so well is that I'm from Flint, Michigan, and he spent his whole career in Detroit. And it turns out we're both lifetime Detroit Tigers fans. So we had a lot to talk about, except he had season tickets and, I could never afford them.
First 3 dates with my wife was at Tiger Stadium.
Yeah, that's right.
Found out many years later that She didn't really like baseball, but
She went with you. Yeah. Did you ever take Jacob Lawrence to Tiger Stadium?
no.
Oh, that's too bad.
But Ramir Bearden wanted to go once when he was in town.
Oh, that's great.
That's fantastic. So Melissa, I'd love to know what's next for the Evans collection now that it's here at Yale.
Sorry, I'm recovering from thinking of being at a baseball game with Ramir Bearden. So our top priority since it arrived in July has been to digitize it in its entirety, which is not something we do with every collection that comes in, but we see it as important enough to share with a broad audience that we do that right away. So that digitization work is happening now as we speak. We hope that we'll be able to publish the whole collection online in the new year, maybe in time for Douglas's birthday or the date he celebrated his birthday, February 14th. And at that time, there should also have a complete finding aid, be fully cataloged and ready to bring to the reading room at Beinecke. So as David mentioned, unfortunately, we're not able to host classes in the Beinecke right now, but students are allowed to use the reading room. The reading room has been open since late August. So we hope that in the springtime, people, including students, will be able to begin using the collection in the reading room. And we imagine that we'll get David's students as well as other students studying the period. In the future, when we're able to resume our exhibition program again, we hope to have an exhibit featuring the Evans collections, not just the Douglas and the Baldwin, but also this extraordinary group of drawings by the artist Ollie Harrington that Walter has given as a gift to Yale. It's a group of about 200 the artwork for Harrington's editorial cartoons. He was an editorial cartoonist for Black weeklies, including the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier and the People's Daily World. Later in his career, he actually got his degree in art from Yale. He was a student at Yale School of Art. So we're looking forward to sharing those pieces, all three collections, with a broad audience as soon as we're able to begin exhibiting again.
Yes, I think we're all looking forward to
that. Can I say one thing further before we continue? Ramir Bearden was a baseball pitcher. I don't know if you know that. And at one time he considered a career as a baseball player.
Whoa.
But, and we almost went there when he was in Detroit. He was the first celebrity that I brought to Detroit back in the mid to late 70s. And because baseball season was going on at the time, but we just couldn't get there.
So we're going to turn now to a couple of questions for all of you, and you can choose which order you want to answer these in, but it'd be nice to hear a little bit more about some of the items in the collection. So could each of you just tell us what your favorite item is in the collection?
Well, if I may go first, am I limited to just one item?
We'll let you have a few.
That was what I was going to ask.
Because
we can do several.
If I could say 1A, 1B, and 1C, I'll put my favorite last. But I would have to mention the eulogy that in Douglas's handwriting that he did for his former mentor, who died in 1879, William Lloyd Garrison. Because they had fallen out of favor for a long time, and just before he moved to Rochester. So this is a handwritten eulogy that's in there. If I were say 1B, I would have to say the typescript for the 4th of July speech that he delivered in 1852. Now this third item might surprise those of you who know anything about the collection, but it's very personal for me. I was born in Savannah, and when I was 4 years old, my family moved to Beaufort, and we stayed there for 7 years until my father died during a hurricane in an automobile accident, and then we moved north. Well, I went to the Robert Small School, which is the only school for African Americans. Things were very segregated in those days, but it was the only school for African Americans K through 12, and I went grades K through 5 before moving north. Anyway, there was a letter that Lewis wrote to his then fiancee, Amelia Logan. And the day that he arrived by ship coming from Boston to Beaufort to Port Royal and docked, he mentioned to Amelia that the first people that he saw when he got off the ship was Robert Smalls and Harriet Tubman.
Right.
This is in my hometown. I have known about Robert Smalls since I was 4 years old. I know everything almost there is to know about him that's written. And it was just when I first read that, which was immediately, you know, I tried to go through everything as soon as I got it. That was actually in the second batch. It just, I mean, chills went through me just seeing that Robert Smalls' name mentioned by Lewis Douglas. So I would have to say that's my all-time favorite of the collection.
Walter, you know every bend in that bay in Beaufort, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And yeah, Lewis is Douglas's oldest son. And those letters really are a treasure.
In fact, where we lived in Beaufort was 809 Duke Street, which was about a block and a half away from the house that Robert Smalls lived in, which was former owner's house in East Point.
Which is now a historic home.
Yeah, it's I think it's 511 Prince Street. Yeah. So I live right around the corner from the grand house that Robert Smalls lived in. I mean, I can't tell you how thrilled I was to see that letter, to see his name. And Harriet Tubman, who served as both a nurse and a scout for the Union Army. He mentioned her name again in one of the other letters. After he was wounded, he went to the hospital and she was a nurse at the Beaufort County Hospital where my mother worked. My mother was a nurse. So that to me is the all-time favorite item in that collection that's now at Yale.
It is an amazing letter.
To have that, I might have kept that one back, but I let it go.
I'm glad you did. But you know, it's like, hey, Dad, I just saw Harriet Tubman. Hey, Dad, I just saw Robert Smalls. It's an amazing letter. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. I'm glad you didn't name my favorite ones because then I'd have to repeat it. But I have many, many favorite things in this collection. I'll just name two. They're in the scrapbooks, and they are the two handwritten narratives done by Charles Douglas and Frederick Jr. Douglas, two of his sons.
Yes.
One is called Life in, oh God, what is it called, Walter? Life in the Douglas Household, or they're both narratives written by the sons later in life about their parents and about the home, and especially about their mother. And as a biographer of Douglas, one of the hardest enigmas you face is getting to Anna Murray Douglas, Douglas's wife of 44 years, who remained a non-writer, non-reader. And these two, literally these two documents essentially just fell out of a scrapbook. I mean, there they were. There was nothing signaling them. They just were folded into these scrapbooks. And to me, they are two of the greatest treasures in this collection, because not only are they handwritten by two of Douglas's sons, but they are access to this family world, and particularly to their mother. And we have so few other sources like that. I have many, many other favorites, but they would all boil down to individual newspaper clippings from towns in Iowa and towns in Ohio and towns here and towns there that allowed me access to this life of the itinerant, constantly traveling orator that Douglas was. And last point, I never understood that Douglas toured the Deep South after Reconstruction, at least not to the extent that he did. And there one day, I'm just going through, I don't know, 1888 clippings, I think it was, and there's Douglas arriving in Savannah from Charleston, on his way south to speak at a kind of quasi-World's Fair in Jacksonville, Florida. And Walter, I remember still calling you over to the table and saying, Walter, Douglas came through Savannah. Did you know that? And I think you said, No, he didn't. I said, yes, look at that. He didn't speak. He just kind of got out on the train, the newspaper clipping said, and waved to people. And he was on his way to Florida. Anyway, I never even known he'd done that. But the ubiquity of these newspaper clippings produced by this clipping service for the family is how only way one can know that. And by the way, so many of these newspaper clippings are nowhere otherwise available, even with digitized newspapers today, because so many of those newspapers just cease to exist.
Yeah, I also love the scrapbooks. They're partly something that hasn't been mentioned is their material qualities are really fascinating. They're a couple of them are really strangely shaped, like they're not long and narrow, but many of them are in ledgers that were used as ledgers and then they're being repurposed as scrapbooks. So they have this kind of palimpsest quality where there's multiple layers of, there's old stuff underneath the stuff that's glued on top, which is always really fascinating. Another object that hasn't been mentioned that it isn't as if there are many of these, it's just really one unique thing in the collection, but I love it, is there's a poster for a one of Douglas's speaking events before the war. That is, it's a broadside, it's a large sheet for an appearance in Boston. With John A. Collins from the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And there's a spot for the date to be filled in and it hasn't been filled in. So you're not sure if they used it or not, but it's a beautiful object. It's very inky, a specimen of 19th century printing. It's very beautiful.
That was purchased as a single item and it was in wretched condition, as was the whole collection. I had to have a lot of restoration done, especially the scrapbooks. I had to have them rebound, etc. But that particular item that you're talking about, it had holes in it. But the restorer was so fantastic. You can't tell that, it was restored, but it had holes in the some of the print work. And I put it I had it restored and put in a frame. So,
oddly, another one of my favorites, and I'll keep it brief, but were the account books.
Yeah.
Kept by Douglas himself at times and then by the sons. And I had never really understood how an account book can itself be a narrative about life. I learned so much about the money Douglas was distributing to children and so on from those account books. They're amazing.
Wonderful. He really gives you a sense of the collection. I've got one more question for all of you, but I'm also going to encourage the audience to please use the Q&A and start submitting questions, because after this question, we'll open it up to the audience for questions for the panel. So I'm curious, what additional scholarship or teaching do you think could emerge from this collection?
Well, I've already mentioned that so many researchers came to the house, and I'm going to miss that. But hopefully it'll be, I'll have conversations with some of the students and maybe professors that call or to ask me about some of the same questions that I'm answering now. But of course, most of that will have to come from its presence at the Beinecke there and or by the digitized files. So I think there's still so much more to be learned from it. I mean, I can't tell you the voluminous amount of material that there is there. I mean, David has described it, but it's a lot of materials, and anyone researching it will have to come again and again. But I'm just so happy that it's someplace where it can be utilized to the extent that it can be now. Because when the researchers came, there were always one or two a year, but now, they can come by the dozens to the Beinecke. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And Ezra Greenspan is writing a book now based on your collection about Douglas and his sons. It's like the father-son story.
We've had many talks, and he's been here. He's 3 or 4 of the researchers came several times, and he's one of the that came by here several times. And wanted to come some more. I called all of them and told them where it was. Once the article appeared in the New York Times, I told all the researchers, but they came to the house where the collection was now.
They'll be disappointed. They won't be coming to Savannah during azalea time anymore.
Well, I'm kind of disappointed in a sense myself, yeah, because I enjoyed them all. In fact, one person you referred was Rita Roberts.
Yeah.
And I didn't know she was married to
Right.
Terrence Roberts until they came to my front door and he presented me his book. And
Yeah.
I was just so shocked that they had not revealed that before coming.
Yeah, he doesn't tell people. He was one of the Little Rock Nine, but
Yes,
he doesn't tell people that until he has to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the Evans collection is going to be so important for Douglas scholarship in lots of obvious ways, but even beyond Douglas. I mean, there's so much material in here, especially the scrapbooks about the Gilded Age, about journalism. I mean, there were 7, 8 newspapers in Washington, D.C. when Douglas and his family lived there. You could be working just on journalism in that era, and you'd want to see these collections. Black leadership in the late 19th century. You want to know something about T. Thomas Fortune, Richard T. Greener, and others with whom Douglas either had friendships or bitter rivalries. Lots of stuff in this collection about race, about Reconstruction, about voting rights, about all kinds of things. Whatever the topic might be, a good finding aid is going to be crucial to help people, navigate their way through it. But there's also just other Douglas books to be written, and they are being written. Remember Lee Faught, who I introduced.
Exactly. Oh yeah, Lee Faught, yeah.
She spent a lot of time there on your dining room table, and she produced this remarkable book called The Women in the World of Frederick Douglass.
I'll never forget her visits.
Well, in fact, her husband, Doug Edgerton, came there and used the Lewis Douglass letters as well for a book he was doing on Black soldiers. So it's, Douglas's entire family went to war. 2 of his sons in the Army, one as a recruiter. His daughter married a Black soldier veteran. The war there's a book to be done just on that.
Great.
I think that the collection, it's obviously going to be a magnet for advanced scholars working on Douglas, but it also has many opportunities for novice scholars, for young undergraduates and other people doing new scholarship, doing this kind of research for the first time. I think it will be accessible to them. It's large for a 19th century collection, but it's not 650 boxes, which is how big the Langston newspapers is. And there are undergraduate senior essays and other research papers kind of just waiting to happen. Lewis Douglas's letters from the front are a great place to look for just a kind of encapsulated research project. And his handwriting is very legible, which isn't always true for 20th century writers. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities even for undergraduates to work in the collection.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, it looks like we've got some questions now. So I'm going to introduce Basie Gitlin, who is the Director of Development for the Library and for Yale Collections, and he will read some of our questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. So the first question is about the provenance of the scrapbooks and other manuscript material. What do we know about the sort of chain of custody before you acquired them, Walter?
Well, that question has been asked many, many times, and I referred them all to the dealers that I got most of it from. And one of the dealers bought it at auction, and that was as far as he could go. And the other bought it, and that same dealer bought a second batch from another dealer, and that was as far as he could go. So we don't know when it left the family's hands, or where the first dealer or the first auction house, where the dealer that I bought it from, we don't know anything beyond that. But I'm willing to share, but he doesn't know. He's still in business, by the way, where I got most of it from. And I'm willing to share that information with anyone who asks.
Second question is also I think for you, Walter, and it's about how you decide what you keep and what you place in institutions?
Well, other than some of the artwork, we gifted maybe 60, 70 major works of art to SCAD. And then the material here at there at the Beinecke, I've kept everything. There have been one or two other pieces. I gifted a work or two to a few other museums, the Telfair, and a couple of other museums around the country. But basically, I have everything that I ever collected. Actually, this is the first time in many, I would say about 25 years, that we have nothing on loan now because of the pandemic. In fact, a few weeks ago, we had a large amount of material coming back from a museum in the Netherlands. That was the last material that we had on loan. But, and it's all because of the pandemic. Otherwise, things would be coming in and out all the time. But I have kept everything except the work that's now at the Beinecke, at SCAD, and one or two other museums around the country.
Yeah, one time, if I could add here, I mean, I was out to dinner one night with Walter and Linda, and this happened more than once. We got to talking. I was trying to show off, and I said, "Yeah, I met Jacob Lawrence once because he got an honorary degree at Amherst College, and the college museum was allowed to have his 22 panel series on John Brown." And Walter said, "John Brown series? I got the second print, and it's back at the house in a closet." He said, "Come on over after dinner," and I did, and there it was in the closet. You didn't even tell me you had it. You know, you never know what's in those closets at the Evans's house. It's just amazing. You probably didn't want me to tell anybody that, but
oh, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah.
People know your house is full of treasures.
To follow up on that, though, at my demise, everything goes to the Walter Evans Foundation. That's still in my possession, so that my heirs don't have to worry about getting, paying taxes on it or whatever, getting everything appraised. But it'll all go into a foundation, and they don't have to worry about. Because I've seen so many collections. As a matter of fact, the Bearden, Bearden's personal, he didn't put everything into his foundation. He had a foundation, but he didn't put everything in it. And there was a large amount of material that went to his estate. And the estate has to, even now, they have to sell off material. I bought paintings, collages from the Bearden estate because they had to sell it to pay off the expenses. And the same thing with Alex Haley. Alex Haley had all of this material. He had the manuscript for Malcolm X, the book he wrote with Malcolm X. And he had the manuscript for it. That and so much more other material. We attended the auction, but it went to the Four Winds. He was living right there in Knoxville, Tennessee. I mean, he could have gifted that, or he could have formed a foundation. And that material is all scattered to the Four Winds now. I have a little bit of it, but it's gone forever.
We have another question.
It could have been in one place.
The Beinecke.
We have another question about the materiality of the scrapbooks and other material. Your descriptions of the collection feel so tactile as you describe newspaper clippings and other materials. Can you compare the researcher's experience looking through hard copies of archival materials versus digital copies? What do you lose by researching digital archives, and what do you gain by doing so?
Your eyesight. Well, any day of the week. I'm old-fashioned. I'll take the real thing, if possible, over a digitized collection. However, I, like so many scholars, am so grateful for everything that has become digitized, including the Frederick Douglass papers at the Library of Congress, are now all digitized. They were not, I have to say, when I started out on Douglass in graduate school. You had to go to DC, to the LC. I don't know. I don't know if anyone has studies and data on this now. Do people pay less attention to a digitized source than they do to a real source? I really don't know. There probably is some data out there on that. You all would know.
Yeah, I think the present circumstances have made those of us who, I think I might side with David a little bit there, that I prefer the real thing too, but it's made us appreciate more our ability to see things, because I currently have limited access to the collections compared to what I previously did. And I appreciate being able to get to them in one way. I think there are ways that we can try to mimic the materiality. It's always, it's virtual. So, virtual page turning is not the same as real page turning, but it might look a little bit more like page turning than scrolling does. So I think that there are these virtual things you can try, and other kinds of photography that you can do, but those are the scale of that kind of photography is limited. So I think that there is a tremendous amount enhancement of access, especially for people who can't get to New Haven. But it's not like handling the real thing.
And people will be able to copy on their computers, whereas, as Walter will tell you, you couldn't put these scrapbooks on a photocopier. He had a photocopier upstairs, and every now and then I'd say, Walter, could I please? No, you can't photocopy off of a scrapbook. If it was a loose piece of paper, like a text of a speech, he would occasionally do that for me, but he was right. I mean,
and you didn't even have a smartphone, right? You didn't have
when I started out, I did not have a smartphone. That's true. And I had a flip phone, and the photos I took on that were useless. So I took hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes. That's what I did.
There were two questions that I think are probably both for Walter also. One, why Yale? Why did you choose for Yale to be the home for this collection? And also, could you describe an item that you have bid on and or tried to acquire and not succeeded in acquiring?
Oh my goodness. The second question first.
The ones that got away.
There were so many that got away from me, so many. I mean, we just don't have time here to tell you. Not so much bidding on, because when I was bidding on the material, first of all, the artwork, Christie's rarely had anything that was African-American in those days when I was doing a lot of buying in the 80s, but they did have text materials. They had a couple of Malcolm X letters, et cetera, et cetera. So they did have, a few manuscript materials, et cetera, where Sotheby's didn't. So if Bill Cosby, and nobody else was really bidding for that material, for the manuscripts, the books, and the documents. So I was getting most of that at auction now. Now the artwork was a different story, because the museums were not going to spend what I could. And if Bill Cosby wasn't there, because he was buying during the 80s, at some point he stopped, and he did show up, or his representatives, whom I knew, by the way. If he or his representatives showed up, then it was lost to me. But that's the only person that stood in the way. Now, what I missed out on were things that dealers offered me, and I didn't get. For instance, what's his name? There were some letters recently that were at Swan Gallery. Ebenezer Bassett.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there were several letters that Douglass had written. Now, some of them.
A New Havenite and buried in Grove Street Cemetery.
That was a lot of letters too. It was like 40 letters or something like that.
No, there weren't that many.
Oh.
No, there were just a few of them.
Okay.
No, I bid on them, and I didn't get them. They were in a couple different sections of the catalog there, and I bid on everything that was Douglas, including those letters. But most of those letters weren't signed, although they were his letters. No, they were signed, but they weren't in his hand. The secretary had written it, and he signed them.
Yeah.
But I know they were from him. They were on his stationery, Cedar Hill, et cetera.
Yeah.
But so I missed out on those because they were just so expensive. My goodness. You know, they had gone up so much. Douglas items have gone up so much in price that they were out of my price range. And I was retired. I retired almost 20 years ago. But there are so many. Now, why Yale? Well, I would have to say that really Yale chose me because there were a lot of other people after a lot of things that I had. But David, by that time, David had been here coming all the time, and Melissa and her team came down and they showed a greater interest. And of course, they had me up there, and I saw how they took care of materials. And I just don't know of a better place, to be honest with you. You know, they were great custodians. As you can tell by the material, that material was in wretched condition. It was 150 years old. It had never been restored. All the bindings, you know, the pages were loose. And I took them up to the University of Michigan Graduate Library, and there was a guy there who restored them for me one at a time. You know, I would go pick them up, and then I'd take another batch, and he would do those on his spare time in the basement of the Graduate Library there in Ann Arbor. And it took me years to get the material restored. But I saw how well that the Beinecke took care of the material, and I was impressed. I wanted a great historian and a great curator, and that's why the Beinecke.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're just about at time, and that is a perfect note to switch gears over to a few closing remarks. So I'm now delighted to introduce my colleague, E.C. Schroeder. E.C. began his career at Yale in 1989 and has served as director of the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library since 2011. During his tenure, the Beinecke has increasingly become a destination for students, faculty, and the general public alike. Before the pandemic, the Beinecke regularly hosted more than 600 class sessions and roughly 200,000 visitors each academic year. And since March, EC has led efforts resulting in several 100,000 digitized images of items from the collection being freely made available online. EC.
All right. Yeah, I'm getting there. Good evening. Thank you, Basie. It's been a pleasure to listen to this discussion and reflect on how, in many respects, this is a story that exemplifies what makes Yale so special. It's a story not only about furthering scholarship, but also about individual and institutional foresight, leadership, and especially collegiality. And positive outcomes such as this result when a leading historian with a gift for building community, a thoughtful and visionary collector, and a talented curator with energy and expertise all work together and find that their goals are aligned. And so sharing important stories broadly and educating the next generation both now and for the long term. This is what we do at the Beinecke Library and indeed all across Yale. And the world-class institution we all love remains vibrant and important even in the face of adversity, and particularly this challenging fall. We've been delighted to share our work with all of you tonight and are committed to continuing our efforts to make all of our collections, including the Evans Douglas collection, as accessible as possible. And I'm especially grateful to Melissa, Walter, David, and Barbara for such an engaging conversation, and to each of you for your support and for joining us today. Thank you, and I hope we can do more of these in the future, and hope to see you in New Haven at some point in the near future as well. So take care and have a good evening.